Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first show of 2026. Happy New Year to all of our friends, fans of Things We Said Today, and Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast. Once again, kind of as we ended 2025, we're starting 2026 by combining the two shows. I'm Darren DeVivo, a co-host of both Things We Said Today and Talk More Talk. It's not too obvious that I'm reading on a cheat sheet up here that I'm looking in this corner because I don't remember anything about myself. I'm a veteran DJ and radio show host in the New York City area for over 40 years. Going to be 42 years next month. And presently I'm the host of Noises from the Valley, it says here, on WKZE at 98.1 FM. Also 105.9 FM in the Hudson Valley, Catskills area of New York State. We're located in Red Hook in Dutchess County. My show, Noises from the Valley, can be heard Friday nights from 7 until 11 p.m. And you can listen at WKZE.com and on our app. And it's in addition to, well, I've already pointed out, I host both shows, as does my friend Ken Michaels, a veteran radio broadcaster with 43 years under his belt. Most of that time broadcasting, producing, and hosting Beatles programming. His travels have brought him through the studios of WDHA in Dover, New Jersey, Sirius XM, to name two. His syndicated radio show, Every Little Thing, can be heard on Sunday mornings from 8 until 9 on WFDU, 89.1 FM out of Teaneck, New Jersey. And then once it's aired on WFDU, you can listen to it on demand for 2 weeks by going to their website, which is WFDU.FM. Plus, Ken co-hosts Talk More Talk and the solo Beatles videocast with me. So how are you, Ken? Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year, Darren.
I left out Ken Michaels Radio. I need to add that to my little list of cheat notes here. Ken Michaels Radio, Ken Michaels website, and it's his YouTube channel as well. And we're also joined.
Now I have nothing to promote at the end of the show.
Took care of it for you. And also say hello to Allan Kozinn, veteran author, reporter, journalist, and critic who from 1977 until 2024, 2014, typo, wrote about classical music as well as the Beatles for the New York Times. He's an author of 7 books, and I think that includes the 2 most recent ones, or volumes 1 and 2 of the McCartney Legacy, which he happened to write with some other guy. No, Adrian Sinclair, our guest, who will get to Adrian in a moment. And the pair also promise Volume 3 at some point soon. Alan's also written a couple of other books on the Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop, and Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Changed Everything. You can read Alan today in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, Highlights for Children, and many, many more. And, of course, coming out of Talk More Talk is the one and only Kit O'Toole, another renowned author. Ken was surrounded by authors. Kit is also an educator, podcaster, music journalist, who has written 2 books, Songs We Were Singing, Guided Tours Through the Beatles' Lesser-Known Tracks, and Michael Jackson FAQ, All That's Left to Know About the King of Pop. Maybe if I lowered this, it would look more authentic. In addition to this show, Kit co-hosts Toppermost of the Poppermost, another podcast with Ed Chen and Martin. Please forgive me if I mispronounce his name. Quibble?
Quibell.
Quibell, of course. Yep. I mispronounced it. And I've spoken to Martin, so I apologize, Martin. How are you, Kit? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Really excited to be here, and it'll be an interesting topic today.
And I hope you enjoyed the introductions. That's our show for today. No, we have a very special guest here, someone who's become a friend of both these shows, a writer. I'll let him tell his own bio as we go through the show. But he is Alan's co-author on the McCartney Legacy books, volumes 1 and 2, and more to come. He has become really synonymous with being an expert, if not the expert, when it comes to Paul McCartney, the authority on all things McCartney, ladies and gentlemen. Our special guest today is Adrian Sinclair.
Yeah.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Darren.
All right, my pleasure. And now, without any further ado, the moment you've all been waiting for, the first Bacho Beatle news for 2026, courtesy of the one and only, and let's be thankful there is only one, Ken Michaels.
Definitely be grateful there's only one me. Anyway, this will be a very brief newscast, actually. The very first news item is actually a non-event, but it's big news. There will be no Fest for Beatle fans this year. Now, we're talking both fests, the one in New York and Chicago. The reason being because Mark Lapidus feels that it's time to freshen up the show, take a break, retool, try to come up with new ideas. And apparently what he's saying is that they will return next year. So I wonder how you guys feel about this. I mean, we all go to the fest every single year. Was this a surprise to any of you? If you just want to comment about this? Kit?
Yeah, it wasn't, to be honest, that big of a surprise to me, because last year, particularly in Chicago, the attendance had gone way down. I mean, way down. I'd never seen it that lightly attended. And I thought, something's got to change. And I just think, it's probably a good idea to take this year off and figure out where they want to go with it. And quite frankly, if they're going to bring it back, it's not 100% certain, but I think it is high time that they made some changes. So it wasn't a complete shock to me.
Yeah. Darren, did you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, it wasn't a shock to me. I had a feeling when the New York Fest took place in Queens at the TWA Hotel for the was that the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' arrival and the Fest's 50th anniversary. I had a feeling at that one that was going to be the end. I was wrong. They did another one in Chicago that year and brought the Fest back last year. I do think the Fest will be back. That's a gut feeling of mine. I'm not privy to anything. I think Mark Lapidus has said, I think this year is going to be a year of how can we keep it going? Who might we get on board to help us with and redefine what it is? And then go into the future with a new and improved Fest for Beatles fans. And at the same time, Mark also said that he is intending to write a book.
Sure.
And I'm sure it's not a cookbook. I'm sure it is a book on the history of the Fest. So in a way, this year might be a year of kind of recharging the batteries and planning for the future. I think there will be a future, but I think it might be very different. The main problem also is the fact, and this is so depressing to talk about it, that there aren't as many guests anymore. So how can you have a convention and with minimal guests? I'm sure there's a way. I'm sure somebody has an idea in their head on how it could happen, and I guess that's what 2026 is going to be all about.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Darren. Actually, if you look at the back of our second book, you'll see we actually had to include a section to talk about people who've passed away, and the list just seems to be growing ever longer. Month after month. I think Allan and I have probably lost maybe 12 people we interviewed for our two books. That's quite, it's quite a lot, and the numbers seem to be declining year on year. The people that have got these first-hand accounts of working with Paul and working with the Beatles, being around the Beatles, that they're not getting any younger, and there aren't as many of them around anymore, which is a real shame. And of course, it's not helped by the declining Canadian attendance when I was there. I think was it last year? Yeah, yes. A lot of Canadians didn't feel like they were particularly welcome in the United States, so they boycotted. Things like that maybe aren't helping either.
Yeah, especially when you're concerned with the 60s. You talk about people passing away. There aren't too many people left who played a very significant role in the Beatles that are still with us. But I do wish that maybe Mark would be a bit more up to date or have more recent guests or people that have been in Paul's bands through the years. I doubt he can get the current band, but maybe, modernize it a little bit more instead of
Yeah.
keeping everything in the 60s and it's always great to have the Lawrence Jubers out there and members of Wings and um, certainly Peter Asher and Billy J. Kramer and those people. But you have to be thinking about who else can we get at this
Right.
point, and also got to be thinking about how technology has changed, and so much of it can now be streamed, and how are you going to approach that, and how much should we be concerned about live attendance as opposed to streaming? There's that element too. Alan, you want to say anything about this?
I basically agree with what everyone else has said. Apart from, I mean, I would mention that the last two fests I went to, I came home with COVID. So, and I know I'm not alone. So that's kind of a concern, I think, and I don't know how they can deal with that. But it's another element of the times we're in, and I don't know. I liked going, but I'm now a little wary of going. So.
Especially where there's a big crowd.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So, for those of you who are hungry for festivals, there will be a couple coming up in the United States. Just thought I would pass this along to you. Beatles on the Beach, which runs March 12th to the 15th at Misner Park in Boca Raton, Florida. Greg Bissonette will be a special guest there, as will Tom Frangione from SiriusXM. You need more information about that, go to BeatlesOnTheBeach.com. Also, there's Abbey Road on the River, May 21st through the 25th at the Big Four Station Park, which is in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Special guests will be Peter Noone, Mickey Dolenz, the Cowsills, Lawrence Juber, and the band Beatles versus the Stones. You can go to the website of arotr.com. For those of you who still want that experience of some kind going to a fest this year. A few significant dates to talk about. January 3rd marked what would have been George Martin's 100th birthday. Where would we be without him 100 years ago? January 4th, Brian Ray celebrated his 70th birthday.
Wow.
January 4th, yeah, he doesn't look 70.
He sure
No.
doesn't.
He looks half that age to me. January 4th is also a very sad day, the 50th anniversary of when Mal Evans was shot to death. January 6th, Mike McCartney turned 82. I also want to let you know there's a brand new Facebook page called Induct Badfinger into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And that's certainly, I'd love to see them in there because I really think they deserve it. But those of you interested, subscribe to the channel. Let me just show you guys this. This is the new book from Aaron Badgley on Ringo Starr called Got to Pay Your Dues. And hopefully I'll be interviewing him on my channel. And I've been talking about this. This is the December issue of Record Collector magazine. The last few years in December, they have devoted entire issues to John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and now George Harrison. It's got everything in here. It's a review of all of his albums, all his singles, his compilations, information about the Dark Horse label, also handmade films. Danny Harrison's catalog is covered in there. It's all in Record Collector magazine. There will be a new book coming out from Hunter Davies, and it's called John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Me. And it's just due out sometime this year. I don't have the date for that. John Bazzini, thank you for that information. And there is a new book that was just released called Paul McCartney's Lost Album, Cold Cuts. And that's by Andrew James. That's on paperback. Finally, we mentioned the passing of Bob Weir, of course, a founding member of the Grateful Dead. So many years of great music from the band, and I did post on Facebook, and I'm surprised I had to be reminded because I was at this concert. Bob Weir was on stage with Paul McCartney in Boston at Fenway Park in 2016, and he performed Hi, Hi, Hi with Paul and the band. And then Rob Gronkowski went on stage and joined Paul and Bob for Helter Skelter. Okay, not only that, but I remember mentioning this not long ago. There was a photo film that Paul compiled of Linda's photos of the Grateful Dead, and you can find it on YouTube. Just says Grateful Dead, a photo film by Paul and Linda McCartney. So very sad to hear about the passing of Bob Weir. At the very end, after they did Hi, 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 Paul said, I think the words were, and there you have the Grateful Beatles. So that's it. Very short newscast right there.
I've got one
I
thing.
mentioned the Billy Preston albums.
Oh, right. That's right.
Yeah, I can't find, I think it's Friday Music that's behind these releases, but yesterday I found out that the two albums Billy Preston did for Apple Records, That's the Way God Planned It and Encouraging Words are coming out, I believe, March 13th on colored vinyl. Now, Encouraging Words is going to be on gold vinyl. And I'm trying to find where That's the Way God Planned It. I forget what color vinyl that's going to be, but purple. That'll be on purple vinyl. And I think it's coming from Friday Music, who have been doing colored vinyl Ringo releases recently. And I ordered some stuff from them a year ago. It still hasn't come in the mail. But anyway, so look for the Billy Preston's in mid-March, 13th, his two Apple albums.
Okay.
Also,
Thank you, Darren.
I've got one other thing.
Okay.
I've mentioned this before, the George Martin scores to be published by Curvebender. You can look for their website at curvebender.com, but they've now finally announced that it's coming out, but they didn't, I don't think, mention a date, but you can order them. It's a 3-volume set. Let's see if it looks sort of like that. Comes in 3 varieties. The sort of plain vanilla version, just the scores, is $400. There are some extras in the version for, I think, $495. And for $3,000, you can get one that George Martin has signed an insert card for. It basically includes facsimiles of the scores he did, not only for the Beatles, but for, all through his career. And there are some recordings of these scores too. They've gotten groups together to do the scores without the main record, but just so you can hear what George Martin's contributions were. They interviewed him to talk about these things, and there's analysis. So if you read music or just want something of George Martin's own work, this is the way to go. I've ordered mine.
The guys, they're also re-releasing Recording the Beatles, aren't they? I think they've remastered that as well. So if you go to Curvebender's website, I read about that recently, that they're doing a remastered version of Recording the Beatles, which is one of my favorite all-time books about the Beatles. Sort of sits up there with Mark Lewison's recording sessions book. So really fantastic productions, if a little pricey.
Okay.
Lots of news.
Yeah.
They've been working on those books, the George Martin book, for quite some time, because I remember having a conversation with the authors maybe as long as 10 years ago. So yeah, it should be interesting.
All right. Well, thank you, Ken. Thank you for the news. As we move on to our first show here, first combination of Talk More Talk and Things We Said Today for 2026 with our special guest, Adrian Sinclair. As I mentioned up top, Adrian and Allan Kozinn together have brought us the red and blue books that are behind Allan, the McCartney Legacy Volume 1 and Volume 2, the first two of hopefully hundreds of volumes on Paul McCartney coming. We know we're getting Volume 3 at least. Is the target, is it 2026 for Volume 3 or 2027?
Probably
Eight?
more like 2028.
2028.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've got
Good.
2 years to write it, and then it takes them about 9 months to do their editorial thing and get it out. So,
Gotcha. Okay. So we have that to look forward to, volume 3, which will pick up in the beginning of 1980, right?
That's right.
Anyway, we're here
more
to
like at the
talk-
beginning of 1980.
What did I say? The end?
You said the middle, but it actually begins on January 16th, 1980,
Right.
to be precise.
But today's show is going to be about Wings. And at the center of this conversation is the new book that came out in November, simply called Paul McCartney, Wings, the Story of a Band on the Run. Adrian has the British edition, which has a different cover than the one that is behind Kit's head and Allan was just showing you. My copy's upstairs, which does me no good down here. It's a book that's edited by Ted Widmer, a companion to go with the Wings album, the Greatest Hits Best of package that came out recently. I think that was December release. And the upcoming documentary, which is going to be premiering towards late February. I've only been told this a dozen times, and I cannot remember the date. It's the 25th of February, and it will be premiered on
Amazon.
Yes, Amazon Prime. Right. I was going to say that. But we have the book here, and now here's this new book on Wings, and here we have Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair, who have written what are the 2 essential volumes covering that period in Paul McCartney's career, the Wings years, with volume 1 starting off right at the tail end of '69, right up to the first personnel change in the band in mid '73-ish, and then from '74, late '73, '74 on to the beginning of 1980 in volume 2. So I guess we've all looked at the book, this brand new one that is the companion to the documentary and the album. Start off with a general question. Your thoughts, we'll start with the non-authors. Well, I'm one of them, but we'll start with Ken.
The unfortunate thing is, having been spoiled on the McCartney Legacies volumes 1 and 2, I think if you compare any future book that covers Paul's history, it's going to be a disappointment, because the legacy books are for those of you who are, I don't want to call them necessarily hardcore fans, but people that want to learn something new about Paul McCartney. Some things that are revelatory that they never heard before. You don't get much of that in this book. This is really geared towards the casual fan. And I still think that it has its merits, because what I enjoy the most about this book is that it's loaded with interview clips, quotes from all the members of Wings. There's even quotes from people like Howie Casey and Jeff Emmerich and lots of people, Aubrey Poe Powell. Even in the very beginning of the book, there's quite a lot, surprisingly, from Sean Lennon, which I wasn't expecting at all. But I find a lot of value in everything that any of the 4 Beatles have said in interviews, whether they changed their opinions or not. It's still where their heads were at the time and what they were saying. Once in a while, you'll spot something that you never heard Paul say before or something. So for that, I enjoy the book. I also like the timelines that are put into the book of what was going on in the world while all this was going on, and what the best-selling albums were in both the US and the UK during specific years. Surprised to learn how Simon and Garfunkel's Greatest Hits was one of the biggest albums for several years in the UK. Great album. But but I still think that it's an enjoyable book for people who may only have a few McCartney albums, or maybe they have a Greatest Hits or the New Wings compilation. I think it's tailor-made for those people, because they're bound to learn a lot of new things in this book, especially about the history of Wings. But it's not anything new that we haven't learned in the McCartney Legacy. I don't think there's anything in here that I spotted that was completely new to me, other than certain things that might have been said in some interviews. And that's about it. But still, it has its value for the casual fan. So I would recommend it for people who are just getting into or only have a few albums from Paul or Wings.
Yeah, actually, that is exactly my feeling about the book too. I mean, Wings to me has, I was a Wings fan technically first before the Beatles, and Wings provided the soundtrack to my youth growing up in the 1970s. And so anything print on when McCartney and Wings, I'm gobbling it up. But it's a lot. As somebody who has followed the Beatles closely, McCartney closely, has worked in radio for years. It's stuff I know, and it's stuff that's been enriched by the two McCartney Legacy books. So there's nothing in there, for me at least, and piggybacking off what Ken said, there's nothing on it in there for me that is eye opening, other than it's a casual read, and an enjoyable way just to go back and read a little bit about this music that means so much to me. I mean, I really have nothing to embellish other than what Ken said. Let's swing it over to Kit, and then we'll talk to the guys who wrote the McCartney Legacy books. Kit?
All right. Well, you just gave me a great segue here, because I'll tell you, Allan and Adrian, I already admired you guys for all the work that you've done, McCartney Legacy, but I admire you even more after reading this book, because what I appreciate from your, the perspective that you both took was it was an honest look at the history of Wings. They didn't always get along. There were some decisions Paul made that were not the best. I mean, I appreciated that balance. And you neither of you ever, fawned over it or anything. And that's was one of my issues with this book. Now, I understand that this was officially sanctioned by Paul. So, I mean, of course, you're not going to have a lot of information about, not paying the band members enough and things like that. I'm sure Paul would have nixed that. But I just thought at times particularly the editorial, the editor's comments, going from topic to topic. I mean, it was just, everything that happened in the Wings era, everything they recorded was perfect. I mean, everything was on genius level. And, that's just it's not true. And, things like the Wildlife album, I mean, it was just glossed over that it didn't, it critically, didn't do very well. And there's no reflection that Paul, from Paul on, what exactly, would he have done differently? And, I mean, it just, to me, it glossed over many things like that. And, yeah, there were tensions in the band at times. I mean, we know that, and particularly from all you wrote about it, both of you. I wanted to hear a bit more of a well-rounded picture. I wanted a more well-rounded picture of the history. As I said, I understand this is a Paul McCartney sanctioned biography, so not everything is going to be included. I get that. But I much preferred your book, not only because it just has a lot more information and some really, as Ken said, revelatory information, but that you approached it more objectively. And I really liked that clear-headed, perspective of, yes, Band on the Run was a brilliant album, so forth. And then there were some albums that, didn't go as well. And I just think it was a more honest look. And so, yeah, as you just said, Ken, and Darren, nothing really new to be learned here, and that's one of the things that bothered me the most about the album, but also some of the fawning comments from the editor, and I just thought, oh, come on, we know they were good, we know they were great, but yeah, there were some mistakes made too. Would have liked to have, had, as I said, a more well-rounded history of the group.
I'm very interested in hearing the thoughts of Allan and Adrian here, because this is just an interesting situation, a unique situation where an official book is coming out at a time that you are writing what is clearly the most detailed books, plural, on the same topic. Let's start with Adrian, and just, I don't even know how to pose the question or whatnot. Your thoughts as this book was coming out. I'm sure it was no surprise. You knew about it for some time, and how you think your series and this book can coexist.
Well, I think we're kind of entering the era of products now with MPL. So what's happened here is they've made this film, Man on the Run, and Morgan Neville, the director, did lots of interviews for the film that some of which aren't actually used in the film, but they appear in the book. So from MPL's perspective, they own the rights to all the interviews that Morgan did for the film. So they're thinking, what can we do to expand on it? Let's do a book. Let's do an album. So it comes as a neat package. What surprised me the most was that they released the book before the film, because it's almost like they've given you the script to the film before you've seen it. But what I can say, having seen the final edit of Man on the Run in December, is that the film is actually more honest than the book. I would say. I'd say the film's a really honest portrayal of Paul's 70s, and I think it's going to surprise a lot of people. As people are going to see and hear things that they've never seen and heard before. So that's certainly something to look forward to. From our perspective, obviously the first thing you do when you open a book like this is you think, well, this was made after volume 1 and very tightly off the back of volume 2. So have they leaned on anything that we did, any of our research? And yeah, there's loads of it in there. I mean, down to, there's like a quote from Rolling Stone about the McCartney album, where from the review, and they've lifted it just straight from our book into here, including the bit that we edited out. So you can tell that MPL have absorbed what Allan and I did, which is really flattering, actually. But at the same time, it would have been nice for them to include a bibliography at the back and acknowledge all of the sources that they absorbed into this book, which they haven't done, which Allan and I go to great lengths to do. Our sources and our bibliography at the back of our book is probably as long as one of the chapters. But yeah, objective thoughts about the book. I really like the format, and actually when we conceived Legacy, my initial thought was that we did it this way, that we did almost like an oral history, because I like the idea, like Ken said, of reading quotes. I like hearing people's voices, and it's something that I really pushed heavily with Allan as we were working on our 2 books, that you need to hear those authentic voices telling the stories, and that's certainly something that comes through in here. But yeah, like you said, I think the disappointment is really that there's very little fresh insight in here. I mean, there's a few interviews with, there's people like Pamela Keats, who did costumes for the tours, John Hamill, it was Paul's guitar technician for 40, 50 years. Stella, Mary, Sean Lennon, people like that talking. But occasionally I felt like some of those people's thoughts, particularly Stella, Mary and Sean, were maybe kind of stepping on the toes of the narrative a little. I mean, Sean Lennon commenting on the McCartney album, which was conceived and written and recorded, 5-6 years before he was even on the planet. I don't understand what relevance that has. Him saying that his dad's copy of McCartney was played. Well, of course it was, but we all know from the research Alan and I did that John didn't have a particularly high opinion of Paul's early albums. You know, I think he said something like he'll make a good album when he's scared into doing it or something, didn't he, John? But yeah, I think, like I say, objectively, there are great things about this book, and for a casual reader, I think they'll learn an awful lot. But for the rest of us who've absorbed a lot of what went on during this period through, you know, various products over the years, whether it's films or books or, you know, official releases from Paul, the archive deluxe editions, you know, this is just going down a very well-trodden path at times. And really, yeah, I'm sure Alan has a fairly similar view to myself.
Yeah, Alan?
It is fairly similar. You know, I also liked reading the quotes. I liked especially the quotes they had from people like Mary and Stella, and also Sean. You know, on one hand, I thought, okay, you know, Sean was born in 1975, so that's halfway through the story. So even when Wings broke up, he was only 5, 6, something like that. But nevertheless, you know, Sean is a pretty good musician himself, and he's close to people in the story, and I'm just sort of, you know, interested in some of the things he has to say. It wouldn't necessarily have been my choice. I mean, it wouldn't have occurred to us to talk to Sean for our books because we're trying to write our books like in real time. You know, we're trying to follow the story as it's happening, and Sean isn't really part of that. What I found a lot of things frustrating. I mean, yes, they quite obviously had and used our books, lifted some quotes and things from it. But on the other hand, um, there are certain stories of Paul's that are the way Paul wants it, and they're told that way in here, even though we've largely proven that something else happened or something didn't happen, you know, or things were misunderstandings, like, for instance, the famous case of Live and Let Die and George Martin bringing the single down and them thinking it was a demo. I mean, you know, we've been through that on this show a number of times. And it's surprising to me that Paul continues to tell that story because George Martin wouldn't have understood because he wasn't privy to the contract necessarily, but Paul was privy to the contract. So Paul knew when they said, "Who are we going to get to sing it?" that they were referring to the second performance in the film, not the title performance for which Paul was contracted to sing. You know, there was never any doubt that that was going to be him singing the title credits in the film. But there were other things too. You know, I just made a few notes. I mean, Paul talks about Phil Ramone producing Another Day, which didn't happen. He worked with Phil Ramone during the Ram sessions, but way later in the Ram sessions, Another Day was recorded on the first day of sessions. He didn't work with Phil Ramone until later on when they got to doing the orchestral overdubs. He says that for the McCartney versus Lennon, Harrison, Starr, and Apple, that he went to court every day. He went to court the first day, and that is the only day he went to court. Um, he, let's see, makes it seem as if, you know, like, okay, you know, he's in New York to record Ram. He's watching the Johnny Cash show. You know, we have the listings for when the Johnny Cash show aired, so we know what he saw when he saw it. And yes, that did inspire him to want a band, but Paul places that in London. They were in bed in London watching TV, and Johnny Cash came on. Just little things like that. I mean, you know, the world is not going to end if he says London instead of New York. Similarly, um, he says that he was in New York when Bloody Sunday happened and started writing Give Ireland Back to the Irish in New York. But we know from Denny Sywell, who let us use his and his wife's diaries, that Paul was in London on Bloody Sunday. The Sywells went to see him at his house on Cavendish Avenue. Um, and then that night, they went to see Mountain at what was it?
The Rainbow.
The Rainbow.
Mm.
And second build was a band called the Jimmy McCulloch Band. So, we know where he was. And also, I think the thing about, Ted Widmer, you would think an editor is supposed to sort of, Adrian and I, when we did this book and we had some questions, the two of us would sort of like, discuss it back and forth endlessly with all of the material we had, saying maybe it was this way, maybe it was that way. What does the material tell us? But also it has to just make sense, right? So Ted Widmer has Paul flying back to New York on January 29th, ostensibly to talk to John about how they should stop slagging each other off. Now, John and Paul hadn't seen each other from 1969 to 1971. December 1971, they met at John's apartment in New York. And among the things they did is they discussed not slagging each other off in the press and in songs anymore. Now, Paul talked about that at the time. It was in the press. Quotes from him: "Saw John. We put all that aside. We're not going to do that anymore." So why would Paul go back to New York 5 weeks later to have that discussion that he already had in December? It doesn't make any sense. So Ted Widmer, I enjoyed speeches he wrote for Clinton, but I didn't think he did a spectacular job in this book. I'm sorry.
It's like you said, Alan. It's strange, because you can see that he's had our books available to him, and he's been, people at MPL have been feeding information through to him. I think that's what it says in the intro of the book. Actually, it says that they provided the research for him. But it's almost like, they only used our research when it was convenient to the narrative that they wanted to pursue. So, why follow, some of the things that we've put forward and then not others? It didn't seem to make any sense to me, really.
Another big one for me was that, like, one of Adrian's research triumphs was finally piecing together the actual timeline of the Band on the Run sessions. And one of the things that we found in that is that the mugging took place on the last day of sessions, when he that afternoon recorded at Ginger Baker's studio, and then they decided to go for a walk at night. And the story has grown over the years. The earliest mentions of the mugging were just, we were mugged in Lagos. Then it was, we were mugged in Lagos and they took our demo tapes. In this version, it's, we were mugged in Lagos and they took the demo tapes and the notebooks with the lyrics. And it's good that, we did the demos because we knew the songs and so we could record them. But the fact is they had done all the recording they were going to do in Lagos already. That was the last night. And maybe it wasn't going to be the last night. I think what happened, to make it the last night really is the next day they went to the studio and Paul collapsed. You wouldn't get that from the timeline as they present it here. It's just something else that happened in Lagos at some point during the trip, but it was the next day. And there were other things about the trip too that were out of sequence. Going to see Fela Kuti, they have that completely sort of messed around. It's like, Fela Kuti first came to see us and then we went to see his band, and it was the opposite, actually. So a lot of stuff like that. He gives the time that John and Paul watched Saturday Night Live
Yep.
and considered going down there as the last time they met, which is not true at all. Um,
Elliot Mintz talks about that in his book. Remember? I think it was 1978. They met
right,
at
Elliot
Dakota.
Mintz. Yeah, right. Um, and let's see, things like, and, all the critics who complained about how much detail we went into. Um, this is a book for them because the McGear album is mentioned in passing by Jimmy, and in the timeline, one of the little timeline entries, um, Jimmy's departure is barely mentioned at all. It's sort of it's a quote from Paul saying that he gets a call from Steve Marriott saying Jimmy's going to work with me, and then Jimmy gets on the phone and says, "Yeah, I'm going to work with him." Nothing at all about what actually happened, which was Jimmy sort of trashing one of Paul's places up, one of the houses up on his property in Scotland, and basically being fired on the spot.
It's the same with Joe's departure as well. I think,
Mhm.
it just says Joe was homesick, and Joe's story is just so, it's actually a really beautiful, complicated story, is Joe's. And I find that, inc I don't know, like you say, just incredibly inconsistent of the editor, really, not to pick up on that. The fact that Joe's wife had a really bad car accident, and his entire life was in turmoil. It wasn't just a case of being homesick. And for me, those kind of what the editor might see as kind of small details that aren't about Paul are what makes this story so interesting. The Wing story is the story of Wings. It's the story of every member in Wings. I think it's the same when they talk about Jeff Britton's departure. And I'm pretty sure in the biography it says that Jeff went on to do a karate film and write the soundtrack for it, which never happened. So yeah, there are far too many things, like you say, that have maybe just glossed over a little too much because I don't know, they're just a little too candid and real to exist in a kind of an official release like this.
Well, he did the film, but Paul wrote the soundtrack for it, and David
That had
Field.
that had been made, yeah, long before then, and the karate film. But there was talk in the press release that they put out when Jeff Britton left the band that he was going to film a karate film in Italy, I think it was, or something.
Yeah.
It was just nonsense. They just made a story up to make his exit seem a little less sordid than it was. But yeah, you kind of come to expect that from official products there. You'll find it in every single one of those archive sets behind me, really. They all kind of skirt around the edge of the truth, and they don't really want to embrace the reality of what is a really interesting story.
I would argue that we have a lot more respect for Paul than the authors of this, whether you consider it Paul or Widmer or MPL or whoever, because, yes, it's true that we don't fawn over him, but we feel that he deserves a story that is, first of all, really detailed about what he's doing and why he's doing it and how he's doing it, but also tells the truth because that's what you want in a figure that you expect people to be looking up to for, decades or centuries. I mean, he's a major figure of our time, and we feel that telling the truth is the job. And that's not necessarily the job of an autobiography. An autobiography is to present the myth that you want people to have in mind. And that's what is done here. This is the myth. Ours is the story.
I will say though, and Ken Michaels will have a lot to say about this because this is a subject we touch on all the time. Every time I speak to you, Ken,
Uh-huh.
that in the introduction from Paul, you get about as close to the truth as you will get, because he makes one comment, and it's a very throwaway comment, but he says that before his bust in Japan and Wings dissolving in 1981, that around the time he was working on McCartney 2, that the inspiration had already begun to move elsewhere. Now, for me, those are the most telling words in the entire book, and they come in the first few pages, because it kind of, for us Wings fans and as academics like Alan and I, confirms what we suspected, really, which was that Paul's mind was wandering when he was working on McCartney 2, and that the inspiration had begun to move elsewhere, and that really Wings for him was starting to become an inconvenience. I don't know what you think about that, Ken.
Oh, well, that doesn't shock me at all, because the one thing I've brought up in the past here is when Paul did the interview with Tim Rice, that is in the McCartney 2. I think it's included in the box set, but he's promoting the McCartney 2 album, and whenever Wings is brought up, it's almost like he doesn't really want to talk about this. It's time to move on. You really get that feeling like that's the past. Wings is the past. And certainly from reading your stuff, this book, Luca Parassi's new book on Back to the Egg, it's making me realize I have a different perspective on Back to the Egg now, because it was always my feeling that Paul did everything he could to promote Wings, to the point where he let Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley give interviews to promote it, to give them exposure. But now I'm looking at it maybe in a different way, that he let them do it because he didn't want to. And yet at the same time, he made a TV special for Back to the Egg. So he wanted to promote the album. So he probably had a lot of ambivalence at that point. And one thing that's brought out here in this book, I have to remember if it's in your book, but he was not happy with the 1979 UK tour. He felt the band was under-rehearsed. Well, if they're under-rehearsed, whose fault is that? Really? I mean, for someone who is so much of a perfectionist, like now, Paul does sound checks before every single show, and he's been doing it forever that way. But if he wasn't that comfortable going out and doing, those dates in the UK, why wouldn't he wait until he's ready and be, comfortable with the way that Wings sounded at that time? So maybe he was really starting to feel like he was getting tired of it. In fact, there's some quotes here that I was going to bring up in the book about it. You can just wait. I know I had it typed here. He said, by the time we got Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley in Wings, I was getting a little bit fed up with yet another lineup of Wings. No disrespect to them, it was getting a bit boring, to tell the truth. Another day, another dollar kind of thing. So that's a quote I hadn't read before from Paul. So I didn't know that he had these feelings at the time. And still, when I think about the fact that Denny Lane stayed with him on the tug of war sessions, it made me, question for many years, where was his head at the end of Wings? Did he really want the band to end? Did he use George Martin as an excuse for Wings to end because George Martin didn't want it to be a Wings album?
It makes an awful lot of sense of some of the things that he did around that sort of 79 period, though. The fact that he was working on a film with Willie Russell that was going to become a vehicle for Wings. It's almost like he was trying to bring in, new ideas to freshen things up, something that would keep his interest going in Wings. And Willie Russell was going to provide that, with his film Band on the Run, which I don't think is even mentioned in this book, actually, because Back to the Egg, some of the songs on Back to the Egg were written with the film in mind. And that was really reinforced to me, actually, when I was listening to the Wings album, the compilation just before Christmas. I was listening to the lyrics and I thought, yeah, this is definitely written with a film in mind. It's almost like he's speaking from the perspective of a character in some of those songs. But yeah, like I say, maybe that kind of that lack of interest, he thought, well, maybe if we, like when they brought Billy Preston into the Get Back sessions, maybe if we bring Willie Russell in, it'll make things interesting. That was maybe Paul's idea for the film. But yeah, I think for me, it was one of the first times I've ever, read him being honest about that period. Quite often he does gloss over it and say that he wasn't losing interest, but yeah, it was quite obvious that he was.
I have a question about that era, and this really is more of a general Wings question than the book. But if you had to speculate, what would have happened had Paul not been arrested in Japan, and the Japanese tour goes on as planned, and there were other plans, whether or not they were etched in stone or just being talked about for the rest of 1980 for Wings? Does McCartney 2 happen? Does it happen maybe at a later date? Do Wings continue on? I mean, in your speculation, if you could speculate while you're speculating, what do you think would have happened had Paul not been arrested? How does the story change?
What do you think, Alan?
I don't know. If he hadn't been arrested, I mean, it's possible that Tug of War would have been done sooner because, we have tapes of him rehearsing some of the Tug of War material with Wings. So maybe it would have, and plus we have a bunch of stuff from after Back to the Egg, a few tracks that they did during jams that turned into actual tracks. So they had the start of something and they were working on other stuff. But I think it's not just a question of Japan. End of that year, John gets shot. That changes a lot. That changes Paul's whole idea about touring, which kind of Linda was lukewarm on in any case. At the end of the 76 tour, she was saying openly she didn't really want to do that anymore. So maybe Wings would have changed in a way to maybe Linda could have extricated herself from Wings. Who knows? It seems unlikely. I mean, she seems an important part of it, and he seems to have really wanted her in it. So maybe he could have persuaded her that more world touring was a good idea. But there were so many things that happened in 1980 besides the Japan bust that could have changed things one way or another. It's really impossible to say.
It's interesting because I was just going to say that, touring tended to reinvigorate Paul at times, I would say. And he was scheduled to play, what was it? I'm just looking at our timeline now for book 3. I think they were going to play to around 100,000 people in Japan. So, maybe that tour would have reinvigorated his interest in Wings and certainly playing to a Japanese audience. He'd not played to a Japanese audience since, 66 at that point. So I don't know, maybe they might have gone on to do a tour of America at the kind of start of 1980. But what ended up happening was kind of what happened with, off the back of Band on the Run, really, which was that kind of Paul tries to work on Cold Cuts again, and then he drifts off and works on the McCartney album. But like Alan said, I think, fundamentally that the death of John really was what signaled the end of Wings, really, because that meant definitively no touring because, Paul went into hiding for fear of assassination off the back of John's death. And that was the end of Wings.
And Denny Lane in particular, he loved performing more than recording in the studio.
Yeah.
That was his life. And for him not to continue going out on the road, what was the point of staying in Wings?
Well, I mean, we touch on that in our second book, don't we? That on the 1979 tour, Denny was off, having little one-night stands, wasn't he, during the British tour? So I think maybe there was certain elements of touring that Denny enjoyed just as much as performing. Kind of, him and Jojo had a very open relationship. So I think life on the road had a lot of advantages for Denny, and it wasn't just performing his music. I think it was the lifestyle of being on the road that Denny really enjoyed. But yeah, certainly in 1980 and into 81, Denny was the most vocal about not touring. And ultimately, I think he cited that as his reason for leaving Wings, didn't he?
Another thing I found puzzling, since we're in this late 70s, early 80s era now, when Paul made a comment about, why he felt Back to the Egg didn't work as well. And at one point he said, well, we hired, young, inexperienced players, obviously referring to Lawrence Joubert, Steve Howley. And I just thought, what? I mean, they were very, particularly, I mean, Lawrence, one of the best guitarists around. I mean, he could play anything. I mean, the way he, kind of made up that flamenco guitar on Good Night Tonight, things like that. I mean, that doesn't really sound like an inexperienced player. I thought that was a very odd comment.
Yeah. In fact, that whole situation has always been completely puzzling to me, because he finally has a band where nobody is going to trash the kitchen at one of his places. Nobody is going to get homesick. Nobody is going to, no one is going to fight with him over the solo. Like, all the problems he had with the previous versions of Wings, it seems were solved with this lineup. And Steve Hawley wasn't inexperienced either.
Right.
He'd been out touring, he'd been playing and recordings. He recorded an album with Elton John. So I don't know why he would say that. It is an odd thing to say.
Yeah, that's pretty experienced. Yeah. I would say. Yeah. I thought that was a really strange, kind of throwing them under the bus kind of comment. I mean, it was really, really odd.
Yeah.
I get the impression from both Paul and Linda that they really liked the middle lineup the most of Wings. Which,
Yeah.
And there's a quote here from Linda. She says, "It's definitely the first group we've had," meaning that middle lineup. "Before, there was always something that was niggling through the show. This was the first lineup where everyone liked and enjoyed being with each other." I didn't know, other than the problems that Henry had with Paul, being kind of demanding and not letting him have the freedom that he wanted to play what he wanted to play sometimes. But there were too many problems with Henry and with Denny Simon.
Yeah, I think some of that comes down to success, though, doesn't it, really? I mean, if you look at that middle lineup, they had the most success. They did that big tour of America. So I think he probably looks at that lineup with rose-tinted spectacles. Wings Mark I had internal problems purely for two reasons. One, they were being paid a pittance. And two, there were, artistic grievances between band members. And possibly, it maybe didn't help Paul's situation that Denny Sywell was so pally with Henry McCulloch. So maybe when Henry had a problem, he would go to Denny and they'd talk about it. And because both of them were being paid £70 a week at that time, that became a collective problem. So, I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that. In fact, when I was listening to the compilation, and I was listening to it in the car recently with my son, who's really into playing guitar now, and I was listening to some of the drums that Denny Sywell played on those early Wings tracks, and he's just such an incredible drummer, Sywell. And I don't ever like to say I have a favorite amongst them, because I don't really have a favorite, but I'd say that technically I'd say Denny Sywell was the strongest drummer Wings had, and him and Paul were incredibly tight from the Ram sessions. So yeah, I do find that odd that Paul would say that was the best lineup. But like I say, I think that with Paul, it purely comes down to success. It was the most successful lineup. That's it, really.
I think it also comes down to some, s- certain dynamics and things that happened. I mean, in the first lineup of Wings, yeah, they may have had problems about the money and problems about whether Henry could play what solos he wanted and all that, but they didn't have those problems every day. You know, those were just they'd flare up sometimes, but otherwise, that first version of Wings seemed pretty tight, pretty friendly. Going
Yeah.
in on the open top tour bus on the '72 tour. I mean, they had some good times. They had some fights too, but I think that when Linda says, yeah, this is the first band where there wasn't some niggling thing, I think she's also looking back on a situation colored by the fact that Henry and Denny left right as they were going to Lagos, and that infuriated Paul and Linda. And especially because Paul and Denny Sywell had been really close as friends. And I think he probably felt betrayed by that. And Linda, Linda is very sort of empathetic to Paul. If Paul feels betrayed about something, Linda is going to take that battle on as well herself. She called immediately after Denny called to say he's not going to Lagos, called him up to say, how dare you inconvenience us. So I think you have to take some of these observations, these first person observations, with a grain of salt, and that is another reason why in this book, another frustration for me is no bibliography. Not just that, it's not, we should have had a bibliography so he could mention our books. He should have had a bibliography so that when we read a quote, we know when the quote was said. Especially, there are a number of people quoted who are no longer with us. When were those interviews done? Were those interviews done towards the end of their lives, or were they done right at the time of the events? It's important to me anyway to know when someone's talking. Uh, so, that in a way is a disappointment too, but this isn't an academic book, so often
True,
academic.
but still, I agree. I mean, I was shocked when I looked at the back and there were no references. I mean, I just, I think you bring up a good point, Alan, that, context matters a lot. If Linda was, it was an interview from, 1975 or, something, and then as opposed to which was looking back on it in, early 90s or something. I mean, your opinion's going to change.
Hmm.
And I agree. I mean, I think that would have provided way more context. And same with Paul too. I mean, obviously, what he said about the group in, in the 70s as he was going through it is different than when he's looking back on it. So yeah, that shocked me that there was no bibliography.
Yeah.
Also, because Denny Sywell was such a big help to the two of you, with his wife Monique keeping a diary and everything, and we're so used to, Denny's been so great to us giving interviews. And there's a quote from Paul here about Ben on the Run, and when I read it, it's like based on what Denny told us. He said, "I did all the drumming on the record, the Ben on the Run record. Denny Sywell was a great drummer, still is, but I was like, I can drum too, and I'm going to drum how you wouldn't have."
Hmm.
Well, that's not what Denny Sywell told us.
Mhm.
Denny Sywell said that Paul basically copied what he did when they were rehearsing.
And we don't know when Paul said that.
Right.
Yeah, it's a strange one, isn't it? The Denny and Paul relationship, because it took them so long to make amends, the two of them. I mean, I was told a story recently, and I don't think this was even in our first book, that during the American tour, Paul's manager went to visit Denny Sywell. This is in 1976. And I remember in our book, we mentioned that Henry was given a check basically to, make up for lost earnings or whatever you put it down to for the 70 quid a week they were on. And they tried to do a similar thing with Denny Sywell on the tour in 1976. And apparently Denny tore the check up in front of Paul's manager and threw it on the floor and said that he didn't want it. And that he said he actually just wanted to talk to Paul. I don't know whether this is a story that's in Denny's book even. Is it? You've read Denny's book. And he said that apparently Paul then did call Denny and the two of them cried on the phone while talking to each other. That's a story I'd never heard before. But it took a long time for the two of them to patch up their relationship, off the back of Denny not turning up for those Lagos sessions.
Wow.
Wow.
I'm so glad that they're close now.
Yeah, it's strange, that's one thing that really surprised me more than anything else, actually, I've got to say, during the writing of our books, is that Paul still has a healthy relationship with most of the former members of Wings. I think the only member of Wings he's not really reached out to and spoken to in recent years is Jeff Britton. But he still speaks regularly with Joe.
He does.
Which I found incredible. Joe told me that when I spoke to him for our second book, and he was still in good contact with Denny Lane before Denny passed away, which I don't think many people really knew. I think they thought that the two of them were still at loggerheads, but yeah, it's not the case.
The Joe English thing I find fascinating because we all know Joe's story, and Joe is in his own world and did not seem like he would be approachable or reachable, even for someone like Paul, or he spoke so like this was his past that he did not want to address any longer. And there was even some speculation that he perhaps was being forced not to play or not to talk about, his rock and roll past. But yet you're saying that Paul and Joe English have,
Yeah, I don't think anybody's forcing Joe to say or not say anything. No, I mean, I think Joe's just very much kind of closed off that portion of his life. If you read the interviews with Joe in this book, they're not very revealing. Some of them, I think, are even done for the archive edition of Speed of Sound. I recognize some of the quotes anyway. I think that was the case with various people in here. I think that's possibly something that was a little disappointing, actually, was, they had access to certain people for the film that we struggled to get to, and they didn't get that much out of them. I mean, it would have been great to hear more from Glyn Johns in here about the Red Rose Speedway sessions, but you just get the same two quotes, I think, that I've read before about what happened during the Red Rose Speedway sessions, where he talks about sitting reading a newspaper while the band just jammed. And then he talks about seeing Paul after the sessions, and they kind of learnt to respect one another. In fact, I think that's one of those quotes was actually taken from the press back in 72 or 73. So yeah, they've certainly made good use of our footnotes, Alan, anyway.
Wow.
There was a quote in the book from Linda about Red Rose Speedway, and she said that it was a non-confident record.
Yeah, she said that in 1976. I can tell you where that quote came from. Yeah. She was doing an interview around the American tour, I'm sure it was. Because that's the frustrating thing when you know this period so well. I was reading through this book and it was almost kind of, I just wanted to go to my notes and find where every quote had come from, because there's no sources in here. And you'll see if you do a keyword search between some of these quotes and some of the quotes in our book that they're longer versions of quotes we used. And in some cases, they even used a couple of my original interviews from Legacy in here as well. There's a quote from John Leckie, from an interview I did with John Leckie, and Take It Tony as well, one of my Tony interviews was used in here as well, which is really flattering. It's really nice to know that my quote is going to live forever inside this book, but it would have been lovely to know the back of the book, where it came from. I'm over it though.
I'd like to ask one question to Allan and Adrian. And when I read this book, and I'm guessing that the film is going to be the same way, there is this angle of the story of Wings is the story of perseverance. Despite all the criticism of the early Wings records, Paul kept on trying. Despite the fact that the fourth and fifth members kept leaving, Paul kept on soldiering on, and then towards the end of the story of Wings, you do get from Paul's own quote that he was getting tired of Wings. So it's not like, again, I'm kind of baffled about the end of Wings and where Paul's head was at the end, because was he excited about the fact that this is a new beginning? It's back to the egg. It's the whole idea of going back to, your roots, kind of like what Get Back was, the Get Back Let It Be sessions. And they're going to tour again with Wings. And then at the same time, he's saying that he was bored. So, I mean, it's a good angle to have. Despite all these obstacles, Paul kept on continuing with Wings. So how do you make sense of all that? Is that an accurate story, the story of Wings? Or did it just kind of crumble at the end?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think the part about how it's a story of perseverance is true. I mean, demonstrably true. It's, you just read the story, that's what it is. Why he gave it up when he did, as we've all been saying, is just so puzzling. But there have to be a lot of reasons. There were a lot of reasons people decide not to continue doing something that they've been doing and have been successful at. Sometimes you just want a new challenge. Maybe he was having a midlife crisis.
Do you feel like if the lineup was more stable, McCartney's outlook on the band would have been different? Because it seemed as though it must have been frustrating in general, having to constantly start from scratch every 2 years, 3 years. But if, say, for example, any combination of Jimmy and Henry or Denny Seiwell and Joe English had stayed together, and there was a band that actually was glued together, that McCartney's views on the group might have been different, and they could have continued beyond in 1980-81.
I guess that's maybe what was so frustrating for Paul about Wings Mark One folding, was that lineup was the most raw lineup, and they went through a lot of scrapes together. The fact that the first tour they did was during national strikes in England, when they were promoting a single about the troubles in Northern Ireland. I mean, it couldn't be more raw than that, really, for a band to hit the road for the very first time on an unannounced tour. You'd have thought that would have kind of bound them together, and I think it maybe did. And then, like you said, the European tour kind of brought them together closer. But I guess with Wings Mark On, the cracks were always there, weren't they? Really, with Henry's drinking and kind of him not wanting to be, told directly what to record on every single song that they were doing on an album. And then really when they shelved the 2 LP version of Red Rose Speedway, I think for Henry that was probably where it was like the beginning of the end, really. So yeah, I think had they been financially compensated slightly more for that period, then maybe the band would have stayed together a little longer, because you don't mind having a lousy time when your pockets are getting lined. I mean, I think we've probably all experienced that in the past, right? That's a really interesting question, Darren. Yeah, would Wings have lasted longer than
if there was more, if there was a more
yeah than
stable,
yeah
you know. I mean, because again, I had to have been frustrating because once you get into a groove with certain groups of musicians, and that was why Wings were formed, of course, because Paul wanted to play live again and have a band that he was able to grow with, that they were actually able to grow together with no material. And he wasn't going to rely on the Beatles material and take it from there. And then after 2 years, it's like, okay, we've got to bring in new blood and start again. And then it happens again. Also, I thought it was interesting that this was, I'm sure, just coincidence that you lose your lead guitarist and drummer in '73 within weeks of each other, maybe days, and then you lose your lead guitarist and drummer within weeks of each other. 2 years after that, 3 years after that, 3 years after that. Didn't tell me
yeah.
that would be involved here.
History repeated itself, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. It was fascinating that it would be the lead guitarist and the drummer right on top of one another. And I don't know, that couldn't have played well for the future of the band. It was becoming like Spinal Tap. When is Lawrence Schubert and Steve Holle going to quit on me?
It's funny though, when I listened to the Wings compilation, and I said this to Alan, and I think he relayed it during your show when you talked about it. The thing that really got me, and I've not listened to a Wings compilation in a long time, was hearing the chronology of Wings muddled up. You know, what really defined Wings was Paul, Linda, and Denny's vocals.
Yeah.
You can fly anybody else in. The styles of guitar and drumming really didn't have any bearing on what defined Wings as a group. And it's interesting, and I said this to Alan at the time, that Paul and Linda get, got such a bad rep as a collaboration, probably because they went on to do things like, vegetarianism and animal activism, and that kind of softened their public image from the hardcore rock and roll, pot smokers that they were in the 70s. But really, Paul and Linda created, a vocal sound that John and Yoko never did.
Yeah.
It's, they probably don't get the credit for what they achieved together there, within Wings. And for me, that's why that compilation was such a breath of fresh air, actually, was just to hear the music played out of sequence. And if you don't have it, by the way, the Super Deluxe Edition 5.1 is just fantastic. You really need to get your hands on a copy of that if Paul Sinclair's got any left on his website. I think Alan's got a copy of it.
Yeah. I do think what you said about the fourth and fifth members kind of like being, I don't know if you said interchangeable, but I think all the musicians in Wings had a big effect on their overall sound. I mean, if you had the first lineup doing the songs that were on Venus and Mars and Speed of Sound, it probably would have sounded very different.
Yeah.
So yes, it's true. The harmonies of Paul, Linda, and Danny are so essential. That is the sound of Wings right there. And
I guess what I'm saying, Ken, is that they weren't like Queen, where Brian May's guitar sound is what defines the sound of Queen, or I don't know. You could think of other bands like that are defined by a certain sound. I think with Wings, it's not so much that the band members were interchangeable. It's that, every single band member that came into the fold, provided something different and unique. But when you listen to those songs back to back, what defined the sound of Wings was those three people, really. And I think it's actually something that Paul and Linda said at the end of 1973, when they were promoting Band on the Run. They said, Wings is the three of us. And really I think that statement kind of rang true, really, through to the time that they dissolved, and that the other players, provided, brilliance, and sparkle across all the records that they did. But fundamentally, Wings was those three people.
And I think the book actually does do a nice job of, underscoring that point. I think many past members talked about what Linda brought to the table with her vocals, and so I think she gets her due in this book. I will say that. And yeah, I agree, Adrian. I think, when you hear those harmonies, you just know. I mean, even if you don't know, I mean, all of us know their songs, but I just think if you were kind of even a casual Wings fan back in the day, I mean, if you hear those harmonies now on a record, you're like, oh, that's Wings.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but the music that Paul recorded after Linda's passing without her harmonies, it's a big difference. There's a lot missing.
Yeah.
You know that Linda helped to define that sound of Wings.
Well, any final thoughts as we now look towards the documentary, which is what's still 5 to 6 weeks away? How long is it going to be, Adrian? You saw it. What is the length on it approximately?
I think it's around 2 hours.
Okay. And compare it in a nutshell to Wingspan?
I don't know, just better, I think. Yeah.
It's been so long since I've seen Wingspan, and was going to crack it out of the old box of DVDs yesterday, but didn't end up happening. But
I was just going to say, fundamentally, Darren, I think it's just a very different film. It's been made by an Oscar-winning director as opposed to Mary's husband, was it, that directed Wingspan? You're talking about a high caliber director and a brilliant production team working for Tremolo.
Right.
But I've got so many things I'd like to say about this film, but I'm under embargo and an NDA, so I need to keep my mouth shut.
But the standing behind you. I see the guy standing behind you. They keep peeking at you.
He just keeps tugging on my back. Yeah, when the film comes out, we should have a conversation.
Absolutely.
I thought the film was brilliant. So yeah.
I'm also interested in seeing how Paul handles this kind of retro trip with a new album coming. Mm-hmm. Are they going to be spaced apart? Is there going to be a way that Paul's going to tie the past to the present at some point, or will they just be completely independent, coming out at different times of the year? Because it sort of came out of left field for me, this whole look back at Wings, and that they would stagger it the way they did, which I think you alluded to at the beginning, Adrian, that the book comes out 3 months or so before the documentary, and in the middle of that comes the album without any obvious, even in the artwork, you would have thought that maybe there'd be a link where, this is the album companion to the book, companion to the documentary. This look back to Wings seemed awfully random, especially coming with a new album, 2026, on the horizon, or so Paul says.
Yeah, like I said, I think it just comes down to two different things. Like I say, one is that we're now in the era of the product, so they're doing their best at MPL to mine their archives. So you get the books that have been coming out recently, the lyrics, the photographs book Paul did of the American tour. So they're basically trying to make the most of what's in Paul's archives. So then these products sit separately commercially. So, the book, like you say, is aimed at the casual reader. But weirdly, like you say, it's not tied in with the album in any way. But I think the timing of the book is purely down to commercial reasons, that they wanted this book out for Christmas. They wanted it out for the holiday market in the States and in Europe and all around the world, I guess, because that's when publishers do their best business. That's why our books come out around that time of year.
Right.
And that's must have been incredibly frustrating for the people who have made Man on the Run, really, because, like I say, it's kind of like giving people the story, 3 months earlier than the film. But that, like I say, I think that's the whole driving force behind everything these days, really, that's coming out of MPL is purely commercial. And I think this year we'll see, 50th anniversary of Speed of Sound. Will it be this year?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we'll probably get a half-speed vinyl.
Half-speed.
If we're lucky, we might get a little extended 2 CD drop. They just want products that are very easy to sell and quick to put together. It's just a little frustrating for those of us who are waiting around for the archive.
Yep.
Archive series to be completed.
All right. Well, let's go around the horn and put a wrap on things. Starting with you, Kit.
All right.
Tell us what you've been up to, where we can find you, and all those other assorted things that are all Kit O'Toole.
Okay. Thank you, Darren. So, of course, you can find me at my website, kidotoole.com, and also on the Talk More Talk website, talkmoretalk.com, and also my other podcast, Toppermost of the Poppermost. That's toppermostofthepoppermost.net. We're putting out new episodes. One just dropped today, I think, as we're recording this. So go to the website. You can catch up on all the episodes there. I'm going to be teaching a class starting next week, January 22nd, on the history of 60s girl groups. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I'll have links up on my Facebook page, on the Talk for Talk one. If you'd like to sign up, it's a 2-part course. This is part 2 is in April. Part 1 is as I said, coming up next week. And Ken Womack and I are going to be doing the latest in our Classic for a Reason series, and we are going to talk about Dark Side of the Moon. So it's going to
Nice.
be. Thought you might like that, Darren. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. Again, I will put up the links to register for that. That's absolutely free. Or no, that isn't. Sorry, that's Brucker Club, but I'll talk about that at the next episode. So, but anyway, you can register at those links, which I will have up, and I think that's it for now.
Right. There is no Dark Side of the Moon, really.
Oh yeah.
Matter of fact, it's all dark. Anyway, Kit, you have to run. I think you
Yes.
need to go. We're going to
Yep.
let Kit go because she has to go put coins in the parking meter. And she can't, please, with all the parking tickets that she's accumulated with
Yeah.
this show. So we're going to let Kit go and then continue on by making faces at Ken. No, Ken, tell us what you've been up to. Bye, Kit. We'll see you
Bye.
Kit.
next time.
See ya.
Kit O'Toole, ladies and gentlemen. Come on, let's hear it for her.
Hey, Kit.
Bye.
See you, Kit.
Bye.
All right.
Then there were 4.
Yeah.
No,
On
that's
my
a
YouTube
Genesis
channel.
podcast. Anyway, go ahead, Ken. What do you? I know you're up to all kinds of crazy things.
Well, actually, you covered it all earlier in the show. At the
Oh,
very
okay.
But real fast, Ken Michaels Radio, my YouTube channel. I haven't done a show for a few weeks. The most recent one was with Harry Castleman and Walter Podrazik talking about their series of Beatles discographies. All together now, the Beatles again and the end of the Beatles. That's a fantastic interview right there. I will be doing an Ultimate Beatles trivia show later this week, and probably a few coming next week. If you want to check out my Beatles trivia page, for which you can win 1 out of 10 prizes every couple of weeks, just go to kenmichaelsradio.com, and there's a trivia page right there on the home page to click on. If you'd like to listen to my radio show, Every Little Thing, the easiest way to do that is by going to WFDU's website, wfdu.fm. Go to their archivals page, and they have the last 2 weeks' worth of shows, which you can click on. And otherwise, if you want to listen to it live on the air, you can listen Saturday mornings at 6 a.m., Sunday mornings at 8 a.m., both Eastern Standard Time. And Talk More Talk, well, we're not sure. We don't know if our next show is going to be with you Darren and you, Allan. Maybe we'll keep asking Adrian to keep coming back,
But what we are going to try to do, which was something just because of scheduling, is try to have shows for you all more frequently or more regularly. Scheduling became just a bizarre thing come last year, which caused us to not be able to churn out as many shows as we want. And admittedly so, my unfortunate situation at that old radio station that showed me the door kind of threw me for a loop too at the end of the year. So whether it's going to be with the four of us or three of us or two of us or half of us, hopefully we'll be able to get more shows together. Allan, your good words.
Okay. Well, so with apologies to Charles Dickens, I'm currently the ghost of McCartney past, sitting with him in jail in Japan right at the moment. And that's sort of, what I'm mostly doing. You can reach me at Facebook, either at Allan Kozinn or Allan Kozinn Remixed. I don't actually turn up on Facebook all that much these days, but if you leave me a note, I will eventually respond. You can reach all of us at Things We Said Today Radio Show at gmail.com. You can follow us on BlueSky at Things We Said Today. You can also follow us on Twitter and or X at Things We Said Fab. And we have a Facebook page, Things We Said Today video podcast, where we post all the shows and all of that stuff. And while you're on Facebook looking for us, you might as well check out the McCartney Legacy Facebook page. Periodically, things turn up there too.
All right. Thank you, Allan. And as for me, you could listen to my new radio show, Noises from the Valley, at WKZE out of Red Hook, New York, 98.1 FM. The funny thing is, within the town of Red Hook, it comes in clearer at 105.1. I don't quite understand, but there's two locations. But anywhere in the world, you listen to WKZE.com, and after being a little uncertain of this, my show is archived. I'm assuming it's a 2-week thing, like with Ken's show on WFDU's website. But the shows do get archived at WKZE.com. And I have found that many of the shows that I've done, there's 9 of them now, they end up having themes that I didn't necessarily plan on at the beginning, and they come together as I'm building the show, and then there's no time to tell anyone, hey, you want to tune in to hear A, B, and C, because, well, A, I thought of on Wednesday 2 days ago, and B is, but coming up, our next show, 10th one, probably be featuring a bunch of Bob Weir, some solo Bob Weir, and some Grateful Dead. Last week I did a 50th anniversary salute to Peter Frampton's Frampton Comes Alive and Bob Dylan's Desire, which were released on the same day in 1976, January 6th, and an 80th birthday salute to Syd Barrett. Played a couple of Syd Barrett solo things and some early Pink Floyd, and played the Beatles Christmas messages, all of them in their entirety in one of the last shows of 2025. So I'm always trying to cook up something interesting on Noises from the Valley, Friday nights, 7 until 11 p.m. At WKZE, WKZE.com, or get their app and look for me on Facebook. I have 2 Facebook pages. Just search Darren DeVivo and you'll be so happy you did. And Adrian, we want to reach out to you. How do we do that?
You'll find our email addresses on McCartneyLegacy.com website.
Okay. Stalking you is not. Are you
as Allan said, we're on.
Are you in a part of England? Are you getting hit with snow right now? Where you are?
No, we aren't.
I think north. I was seeing something yesterday. They were getting an abnormal amount of wintry weather that is unusual. So I was wondering if that was where you are.
Not here. We got a light dusting, Darren.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about as exciting as the last 2 weeks got for us.
All right.
I was just going to say, Darren, you mentioned the Beatles Christmas records.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to go to Abbey Road Studios over Christmas because they do these little concerts and they're open to the public. And by all accounts, not a lot of people really know that they exist. But basically, they have a string quartet come into Abbey Road Studios, into Studio 2, and they play Christmas songs, including string arrangements of pop songs. And they played some of the Beatles Christmas records, and then they segued into some Beatles songs that they played as a quartet. And one of them was an amazing quartet arrangement of "Wonderful Christmas Time."
Oh, nice.
Which the cello playing the synth part was a particular highlight. I think you can find it on YouTube. But if any of your listeners are over in England next Christmas, I think by all accounts they're going to do the same thing again. And it's a really rare opportunity to get inside Studio 2. Yeah, so check it out if they're doing the same thing again next year. It's a lot of fun.
You know, I don't really talk about this much, but for whatever reason, I don't know. But I was actually the winning bidder when Frida Kelly put her personal archives up for auction, and she had a complete set of the 7 Beatles Christmas records, the UK records. In fact, if you've seen the film Good Old Frida, goes up in her attic and is going through a lot of the belongings that she had from her years as the fan club president, and she kept a copy of each one of the Christmas albums, Christmas records rather, the singles in an album, and they even used a couple of them for the masters for the finished records. And it's probably my prized possession now, as I was the winning bidder and bought those last year. But I did not play them for the radio show. Okay, I used another source for that, and I'm not telling you what it was. But anyway, Adrian, thanks for taking the time out to talk with us about that other Wings book that's out now, and hopefully we'll see you soon, maybe when the documentary comes out. Now, for Kid O'Toole, for Ken Michaels, for Allan Kozinn, thanks for hanging out with us in this combination. Things we said today, Talk More Talk, first show of 2026. Thank you, my friends. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Peace and love.